Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. Sometimes we don't notice how easily life turns into a routine. The same faces, the same actions, the same conversations. But one day, completely unexpectedly, someone or something appears in the midst of ordinary life that turns everything upside down. And then you begin to wonder, am I living the right way? Maybe this new person is a sign that there should be more to life than familiar stability? I didn't even realize when my world began to change, though not long ago it seemed like everything was stable in my relationship with my husband. But as soon as Louis Stevenson entered my life, I realized that stability can turn into emptiness. I didn't know then how it would all end. But now, looking back, I understand. It was the beginning of the end. My day started like any other. With an early wake-up, coffee, and a long stare in the mirror, Tom was already at work. Our morning conversations had boiled down to exchanging routine phrases. How did you sleep? Fine. Then, as usual, I rushed out of the house, running late for the office. The advertising agency where I had worked for several years had become my second family. I took pride in my job, my progress, and the respect I had earned from my colleagues. Louis Stevenson, our new manager, had joined the agency just over 6 months ago, but had already gained authority. He wasn't your typical boss. It seemed he always knew exactly what to say and how to connect with each employee. I remember our first work conversation when he came into my office to discuss a project. I was sitting at my desk, focused on reading documents, when he suddenly appeared at the door, lightly knocking but not waiting for an invitation. "Megan, do you have a minute?" His voice was low and confident. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and something in his gaze made me tense up inside. It was something inexplicable, like a jolt of electricity running through my body. "Of course, Louis, come in," I replied, trying to appear calm, though my palms suddenly began to sweat. Louis sat down across from me, and our usual business conversation began. He talked about the tasks I was working on, what needed improvement, and how to approach the issues creatively. But what surprised me was his manner of speaking. In every word, there wasn't just confidence, but a kind of magnetic pull, as if he was communicating not just with words, but on an emotional level as well. I caught myself unable to take my eyes off him. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp facial features. But it wasn't just about his appearance. His presence in the room was almost tangible. It felt like the air around us became heavier, even though the conversation remained strictly professional. When Louis left, I sat there for a few more minutes, staring at the empty chair and reflecting on the conversation. What was that? Why did it feel like I spoke to him differently than with other colleagues? I tried to attribute my thoughts to work stress, but something inside told me it wasn't just that. Several days passed, and our team continued working on the project under his leadership. Louis regularly called meetings, and each one gave me more reasons to think. At first, I thought it was just my nerves. New management always makes you feel a bit insecure. But every time he spoke, my thoughts drifted far away from work. I began noticing him in a new way. His movements, his manner with others, his ability to charm everyone in the room. One day, after another meeting, Louis approached me and, to my surprise, suggested we grab coffee after work to discuss some ideas. His offer sounded completely innocent, but something in his tone made me wary. "I think we should go over a few project details. Will you have time this evening?" His voice was as calm as ever, but there was something more than just professional interest in it. I froze for a moment, but quickly gathered myself. "Sure, after 6 works for me," I answered, trying not to overthink the fact that everything inside me had suddenly come to a halt. That evening changed a lot. When we met at the cafe, I couldn't help but notice that Louis was different outside the office. He was more relaxed, yet he still had that same charisma. We talked about work, but gradually the conversation shifted to more personal topics. He began sharing about himself, how he started his career, his hobbies, and how he envisioned the future of the agency. His sincerity surprised me, and before I knew it, I was telling him more about myself than I usually would with colleagues. "How's your personal life?" he suddenly asked, and his gaze became a bit more probing. I hesitated. What could I say? My marriage was normal. Tom and I rarely fought, but the joy in our relationship was fading. We lived comfortably, but without passion. But I couldn't say that to Lewis. "Everything's fine," I replied, trying not to reveal my true thoughts. He nodded, but I felt like he understood something. His gaze grew deeper, and I became uncomfortable with the attention. I didn't know what exactly he was looking for in my eyes, but his presence once again made my heart race. When I got home, I couldn't get Lewis out of my head. Every gesture, every word spoken at that table replayed in my mind, like bright flashes of light in a dark room. What was that? Why did I react so intensely to a simple conversation? From that night, I knew. Lewis was not just my boss. This was only the beginning. If someone had asked me back then, at the very beginning, if I could have predicted how far things would go, I would have surely laughed in response. After all, it seemed impossible. At work, I was a professional. In my marriage, I had stability. And I viewed Lewis as nothing more than my boss. But slowly, the delicate threads of our conversations began intertwining into something more, and I didn't notice how I got trapped by my own feelings. Lewis wasn't just an excellent leader. He had a rare talent for motivating and inspiring people. There was something special about his ability to see potential in me that I had long forgotten. One day, while I was buried in a difficult project, overwhelmed by the flow of tasks, Lewis approached me. I didn't expect him to pay me such attention, but as always, he was calm and confident. "Megan," he said, leaning over my desk, "you've got this. I know it's not easy, but you've already shown what you're capable of. I'm confident you'll pull off this project at the highest level." Those words, spoken with such sincerity, made me feel a warmth inside. In recent months, Tom had rarely supported me. His attention was consumed by work, and our conversations had become shorter and more superficial. But Lewis, it felt like he truly saw the real me, as if he knew what I really wanted. With each passing day, our interactions became more frequent. We discussed work projects, but over time, we began shifting to more personal topics. It happened gradually, imperceptibly, as if our conversations naturally slid from professional matters to a more intimate level. One evening, after all the employees had gone home, Lewis and I were once again the only ones left in the office. I don't even remember what we were discussing, but the conversation naturally shifted to personal matters. I told him about my hobbies, how I dreamed of becoming a designer as a child, but chose advertising for the better chance at a stable career. Lewis listened intently, his gaze focused and sincere, and at some point, I realized I was no longer talking to him as my boss. This was a conversation between two people who were gradually opening up to each other. "How's your personal life?" Lewis suddenly asked, looking at me with interest. "You rarely mention your husband. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Inside, everything was a mess. What was I supposed to say? That in recent months, our marriage had grown cold, and that every time Tom hugged me, I felt something important slipping away? Or maybe I should mention how, when I talk to Lewis now, my thoughts get jumbled, and I can't focus on anything else but him? "Everything's fine," I finally replied, trying to sound calm. But Lewis noticed the hesitation in my voice. "Fine isn't a word a happy person uses," he said, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Maybe I shouldn't pry, but sometimes it's worth admitting when something's missing." His words struck me. It was exactly how I had been feeling for the past few months, but I had been afraid to admit it even to myself. My marriage had become empty, devoid of the passion and fire that once existed. And here, sitting in front of me, was someone who understood me better than anyone else. That night, I returned home with a heavy heart. Tom, as usual, was busy with his own affairs, and we barely exchanged a few words. I tried to distract myself, but thoughts of Lewis wouldn't leave me. His words echoed in my mind, like a reverberating sound. Fine isn't a word a happy person uses. And as I looked at Tom, I realized I could no longer pretend. The following days, I felt strange. Lewis was at the center of my thoughts, even when I was at home with Tom. I began noticing how he was growing more distant, consumed by his own tasks. His absence only highlighted the growing rift that had long existed between us. At work, however, the situation kept evolving. Lewis and I began staying alone together more often after work, discussing not just professional matters, but more and more personal topics. One day, he told me about his own struggles, about how his previous relationships had fallen apart due to a lack of time and understanding. "Sometimes work consumes us completely," he said, staring off into the distance, "and we lose touch with the people who matter to us." I nodded, understanding that his words didn't just align with my situation, they mirrored my own reality. It seemed like Lewis was becoming something more to me than just a boss. His words resonated with me, and every touch, even accidental, sent shivers down my spine. Our glances met more and more frequently, and there was something unsaid in them. I felt an invisible pull growing between us, but I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge it aloud. Lewis wasn't just attractive, he was someone who could understand me. His presence filled my days with new colors. One evening, when we were once again the last two in the office, Lewis unexpectedly suggested we take a walk. "It's too stuffy in here," he said, rubbing his neck. "Maybe we could go outside and get some fresh air?" I agreed without thinking. We walked through the city streets, the evening sun softly lighting our faces, and the conversation flowed easily, as if there wasn't even a hint of tension between us. But I knew that wasn't the case. Inside, I was in turmoil, and I understood that the pull between us wasn't just an illusion. When we stopped by a small park, Lewis turned to me, and I saw something new, something elusive, in his eyes. He was calm, but there was a spark in his gaze. It suddenly became hard to breathe. "Do you think about me as much as I think about you?" he asked softly, never breaking eye contact. His words caught me off guard. My mind screamed at me to stop, to say that this was just work, that we both had our own lives. But my heart had already made its choice, and at that moment, standing next to Lewis, I realized that my relationship with him had already crossed the line of professionalism. That evening, when Lewis offered to give me a ride home, started like any other ordinary day. There was no sign that my inner doubts and anxieties would disappear in a single moment. We had stayed late, discussing a new project. I was immersed in work, but with each passing hour, I felt the tension between us grow, becoming almost palpable. When Lewis popped his head into my office near the end of the day, I wasn't surprised by his offer. "Megan, you must be tired," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Let me drive you home. I don't want you going home alone this late." His offer sounded innocent enough, but I felt that there was something more behind it. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if I should agree. My heart started to beat faster. All the moments we had spent together, all the looks, all the conversations, they had led to this evening. "All right, thank you," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. We went down to the garage, and I got into the passenger seat of his car. The car was quiet, with only the sound of the engine breaking the silence. Lewis drove slowly, talking to me about work, but I couldn't focus anymore. My thoughts were entirely on him, on how he sat next to me, on how his hands confidently held the steering wheel. When we pulled up to my house, the silence in the car became especially heavy. Lewis turned off the engine and looked at me. Our eyes met, and at that moment, the world around us seemed to freeze. "You look really tired tonight," he said quietly, but there was something else in his voice, something that revealed his true feelings. "Yeah, it's been a tough day," I replied, not breaking eye contact. His eyes seemed even deeper in the dim streetlight. We stayed silent, and the tension between us grew. At some point, I realized that I couldn't resist anymore. Everything that had come before, all my doubts, all my attempts to convince myself that this was just a professional relationship, suddenly didn't matter anymore. Lewis didn't wait any longer. He leaned towards me slowly, and I felt his hand gently touch my face. His touch was soft, barely noticeable, but it made it even harder for me to breathe. I froze, feeling each passing second as if time had stopped. "Megan," he whispered so softly, I could barely hear him, but there was something magical in his words that made me shiver. "I can't hide this any longer." The next moment, his lips touched mine. It was so tender and careful at first that I didn't immediately realize what was happening. But then my body responded. I felt something ignite inside me. The doubts that had plagued me for weeks vanished. In that moment, I knew. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. This was what I wanted. I kissed him back, gently pressing my lips against his. At that moment, the world around us ceased to exist. It was just Lewis, his warmth, his breath. I could no longer ignore my feelings. They poured out, overwhelming me completely. His kiss was tender at first, but soon it deepened, becoming more intense. I felt his hand lightly trace my face, then my shoulder, and my head began to spin. I had completely lost control of myself. Everything I thought I knew about right and wrong was erased in an instant. We pulled away from each other, both breathing heavily. I sat there, unable to say a word, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Lewis looked at me as if he was seeing me in a new light. There was determination and passion in his eyes, something I could no longer deny. "Megan," he said quietly, "I've wanted this for a long time, and I think it's not just me." I couldn't respond, but my eyes spoke for me. In that moment, all the barriers fell. I wasn't thinking about the consequences, about what would happen next. I knew only one thing. I could no longer pretend that there was nothing between us. I tried to regain my composure, but it was useless. My entire life with Tom, everything I once considered stable, suddenly seemed like nothing more than a veil, a barrier to real feelings. I knew that what had just happened between Lewis and me would change everything, but I also knew that there was no turning back. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, both struggling to process what had just happened. I felt a powerful, invisible force between us that could break free at any moment. I was ready for it. My body, my emotions, everything told me that I wanted more. "I'll walk you to your door," Lewis offered, his voice now much calmer, but still with that dark, deep tone that made me shiver. "No, you don't need to," I finally responded, knowing that if we spent any more time together, things would spiral out of control. Lewis nodded, understanding my state. I opened the car door and stepped into the cool evening air, trying to collect myself, but even the chill of the night couldn't cool my thoughts. Inside, my emotions were raging, and I didn't know how to deal with them. When I walked into the house, Tom was already asleep. I stood in the darkness of our bedroom, staring at his sleeping face, unable to believe that just a few minutes ago I had experienced something so powerful and real with another man. A wave of guilt washed over me, but it was weak, barely noticeable. All I could think about was Lewis, how his lips had touched mine, how I had felt alive, as if I had woken up from a long slumber. That kiss changed everything. I knew that tomorrow would bring a new day, new conversations, and that from now on, my relationship with Lewis would never be the same. But in that moment, I couldn't think about anything else. I knew only one thing. That evening was just the beginning. When the boundaries blurred and the first forbidden steps were taken, I knew there was no turning back. Every kiss, every glance, and every touch left me with no choice. I found myself at a crossroads in my life, and it seemed like the road leading to Lewis was the one pulling me in the strongest. On the other hand, I was still aware that Tom remained in my life. He was my stability, my husband. But now, that stability felt distant, almost intangible. After that evening, when our lips met for the first time, Lewis and I didn't discuss what had happened. We simply continued our relationship on a new level. It happened naturally, as if we had been heading toward this moment for a long time. At first, it was brief encounters at work, fleeting glances, and accidental touches that only fueled our desire. It soon became clear that work moments weren't enough for us. We began looking for ways to spend time together. Lewis was careful. He suggested places where no one could see us, where we could simply be ourselves, without the masks of professionals. These were evening walks in parks, dinners at restaurants far from the city center, and even trips to small countryside cafes where no familiar faces could accidentally spot us. Every time I was with Lewis, I felt everything inside me bubbling. His touches were passionate, his kisses searing. Every moment with him was filled with a passion I had long forgotten. Our meetings became a necessity for me, as if I could no longer exist without them. Every evening I spent with him was filled with a secret sense of excitement and risk. But as soon as I returned home, reality would wash over me with a wave of guilt. Tom greeted me with a kind smile, caring and attentive as always. He was so predictable, so right. His attention and support were always there, but now I saw them differently. Every look, every touch from him filled me with anxiety, as if I was betraying something sacred. And that feeling grew stronger each day. I tried to fight with myself. Every time I came home after seeing Lewis, I told myself, this was the last time. You can't keep doing this. But as soon as the morning came and I saw Lewis at work, all my promises disappeared. His presence filled my life so completely that I could no longer ignore my feelings. I was drawn to him like a moth to a flame, even knowing that in the end, I might get burned. One evening, when Lewis asked me to meet after work, I realized that the situation was becoming too serious. We agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. I arrived early and sat at a corner table, nervously fiddling with the spoon in my hands. My heart was racing as if I were waiting for something important, even though I knew it was just another one of our meetings. Lewis walked into the cafe and immediately found me with his eyes. His confidence, his calmness, it all made me lose my head. He sat across from me, his hand brushed against mine, and I felt everything inside me tighten at his touch. "Are you all right?" he asked, his gaze studying me intently. I wanted to answer that, yes, everything was fine, but the words caught in my throat. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Lewis, I started, but didn't know how to finish. Words seemed inadequate to describe everything going on inside me. He squeezed my hand a little tighter, and I saw something in his eyes that made me tremble. It was the same passion I had felt from the beginning, but now it was stronger. He looked at me as if I were the only woman in the world, and that was dangerous. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his voice gentle but sure. "I know this isn't easy for you." His understanding caught me off guard. I had expected anything from him, pressure, passion, but not this calm acknowledgement that I was at a crossroads. It was as if he was giving me a choice, but I knew I had already made it long ago. We talked for a few more minutes, but the conversation became a formality. Deep down, I knew that our attraction to each other was only growing stronger, and this was no longer just an infatuation. It had become something bigger, something we could no longer control. When we left the cafe, Lewis suggested we take a walk. The moment he took my hand, I realized I could no longer hide my feelings. We were far from any prying eyes, and I could no longer hold back my emotions. I pressed myself against him, and he immediately wrapped his arms around me, as if he had been waiting for this. His lips found mine again, and this time, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a passion that we could no longer contain. That night, I returned home with a sharp feeling that I was walking on thin ice. Tom greeted me as usual, but I felt that everything inside me had changed. My feelings for him were no longer the same. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Every time I was with Lewis, I forgot about everything else. But as soon as I returned home, the internal conflict overwhelmed me. I knew I was betraying Tom, and that caused me pain. But I couldn't give up Lewis. I couldn't make myself let go of what we had. Each of our meetings with Lewis brought me more joy, but also more guilt. It was like a drug. I couldn't stop, even though I knew it was destroying my life. We met in secret, choosing the most secluded places where no one could see us. Each time it became more thrilling, and the passion between us grew with every encounter. But alongside that, my internal anxiety also grew. I knew this couldn't go on forever. I couldn't deceive Tom indefinitely, but I also couldn't give up Lewis. There was a battle raging inside me, and I didn't know how it would end. But in those moments when I was with Lewis, all my doubts disappeared. I lived for those moments, for that passion, and nothing else mattered to me. Every meeting with Lewis was like a new turn in a crazy spiral, pulling me deeper and deeper. I couldn't stop, even if I wanted to. He became more than just someone with whom I could share passion and desire. He understood me better than anyone else. I felt that something more than just a secret affair was growing between us, but it scared me. I knew that sooner or later, the situation would spiral out of control. One day, after a long day at work, Lewis stopped by my office, as he usually did. His expression was calm, but I noticed something new in his eyes, an elusive determination. "Megan, I have a proposition for you," he began, sitting down on the edge of my desk. "Next week, I have to go on a business trip to finalize a deal with a major client. I'll need your help. You know the project better than anyone." I nodded, trying to focus on his words, but I felt my heart tighten in anticipation. I knew that a business trip with Lewis would not be strictly professional. "It'll be a good chance to get away from the office for a bit," he continued, his voice slightly lower than usual. And spend some time alone. Those words sounded like an invitation to something more. My mind reacted instantly. I understood that a few days away from everything and everyone holding us back could be a moment of truth. I couldn't avoid this decision, but at the same time, I couldn't refuse what Lewis was offering. "Do you think it's the right thing to do?" I asked, unable to hold back my doubts. He leaned toward me, his gaze serious but filled with genuine care. "I think it's what we both want," he answered softly. "If you're not ready, I'll understand. But if you want this as much as I do, we'll have a chance to spend a few days away from everything." His words felt like a promise, but I knew the decision was mine. Inside, a storm of emotions raged. I realized that this trip could be the point of no return. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't say no. "All right," I said, accepting that resistance was futile. "I'll go with you." Lewis smiled, his expression softening, but there was still a passion in his eyes that pulled me deeper. He knew that our relationship had reached a new level, and there was no more room for doubt. We left early Monday morning. Lewis picked me up from my house in his car, and I watched as Tom waved goodbye from the porch. At that moment, I felt guilt acutely, but it didn't last long. Once the car started moving and we left our familiar lives behind, I allowed myself to forget everything. It was just Lewis and me, the road ahead, and a few days of freedom. At first, our conversation was all about work. We discussed the project, the details of the meeting with the client, and everything seemed perfectly innocent. But I knew it was just an excuse to be together. As the miles passed, the tension in the car grew. We both knew what was happening, but neither of us wanted to be the first to break the fragile balance. When we finally arrived at the hotel, we were greeted at the reception. Lewis had already booked the rooms, and I noticed that our rooms were right next to each other. It was a deliberate choice, and my heart raced even faster. I knew what was ahead of us, but I still tried to convince myself that I could hold back. After settling into our rooms, we went to meet the client, and everything went perfectly. Lewis, as always, was confident, and I watched how easily he connected with people. Time flew by, and soon we were sitting in the hotel restaurant, celebrating the successful deal late in the evening. "You did great," Lewis said, raising his glass of wine. "I couldn't have closed this deal without you." His words brought a warm wave of gratitude, but it wasn't just a compliment. His gaze told me more than his words. I felt that he wanted to say something else, but instead, he just raised his glass and took a small sip. We continued the dinner in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was filled with anticipation. We both knew that this evening would be decisive. When we returned to the hotel, Lewis walked me to my door. I stood at the threshold, unable to take a step inside. He stood next to me, his presence almost tangible. "Megan," he said quietly, stepping closer, "if you want, I'll leave. But if not..." His voice trailed off, and he looked into my eyes, waiting for an answer. I couldn't lie to myself any longer. I didn't want him to leave. My hand slowly touched his, and that was all Lewis needed to understand. He took a step forward and gently embraced me, his lips finding mine again. And this kiss was different. It was filled with the passion we could no longer hide. I opened the door and we entered the room. At that moment, everything that held me back disappeared. We couldn't stop anymore. Those few days we spent together became something special for us. We were far from everything: responsibilities, people, reality. It was our little haven where we could be together without thinking about the consequences. We savored every moment, forgetting about everything else. But deep down, I knew that this illusion couldn't last forever. When we returned home, I felt the same heaviness that always surrounded me when I was with Tom. New decisions and consequences awaited me. I didn't know how long I could keep balancing between two lives. But while I was with Lewis, everything else ceased to exist. Returning home after the business trip with Lewis wasn't at all what I expected. As soon as our trip ended and reality washed over me again, I realized that I could no longer ignore what was happening in my life. Lewis and I had spent a few magical days together, forgetting everything that surrounded us. It had been a perfect moment, but now it was behind me, and I was back in my familiar environment. When I entered the house, Tom was already there. He greeted me, as usual, with warmth and care, but I sensed something new in his gaze: suspicion. I tried to smile, hiding all the emotions I had experienced in the past few days, but inside, a storm was raging. In that moment, I knew I could no longer hide. My double life was beginning to crumble right before my eyes. "How was the business trip?" Tom asked, watching me closely. His voice was calm, but there was tension beneath it. This was the first time he openly showed his concern. I knew he sensed something was wrong, but maybe he couldn't yet put it into words. "It went well," I replied, trying to sound relaxed. "We closed an important deal, and the project is moving forward." Tom nodded, but his eyes never left me. He was studying me as if trying to find answers to his own internal questions. I felt my breath growing heavier, and I wanted to leave the room as quickly as possible. "You look different," he said, and his words pierced me like a knife. "Just tired," I answered, averting my gaze to avoid meeting his eyes. It was a long trip, a lot of work. But I knew that was only a half-truth. The real reason for my exhaustion wasn't the business trip, but the fact that my feelings for Lewis had consumed me. Every day, I was drifting further away from Tom, and now he was noticing. The next few days became a real test for me. Tom started asking more and more questions about work, the business trip, and how Lewis and I spent our time. He wasn't aggressive or openly suspicious, but there was an underlying worry in his voice that left me unsettled. I felt like I was walking on thin ice, ready to fall through at any moment. Every evening, as we sat together at dinner, I tried to act as if nothing had changed. We talked about work, future plans, and the small details of daily life, but every word felt like a lie. I sat across from my husband, the man I had spent so many years with, but my thoughts were far from him. I was sinking deeper into memories of Lewis, of our meetings, of the emotions I felt when I was with him. It seemed that Tom noticed this. More than once, he tried to start conversations about our marriage, but I skillfully avoided any deep discussions. I was afraid that if I started talking, all the emotions I had been hiding would spill out, and I wouldn't be able to control the situation. One evening, as we sat on the couch after dinner, Tom suddenly spoke. "Megan," he began, his voice soft but determined at the same time. "I feel like something's wrong. You've changed. We've changed." I froze. Inside, I felt a chill. These were the exact words I had feared. I didn't know how to respond, and I tried to hide my anxiety. "What are you talking about?" I attempted to smile, but the smile felt forced. "You've been distant," he continued, looking straight into my eyes. "I don't know what's going on, but I can see that something has changed, and it's not just work." His words cut deep. This was the moment I realized that I couldn't keep hiding any longer. Tom was right. I had changed, and our relationship was no longer the same. I felt guilt, but it wasn't enough to stop me. "I'm just tired," I lied again, lowering my gaze. "A lot of work, a lot of stress. Everything's fine." Tom was silent for a moment, his eyes filled with pain and doubt. I knew he didn't believe me, but he couldn't bring himself to ask directly. "If something's wrong, just tell me," he said, his voice almost pleading. "We can fix it if you give me a chance." His words tore me apart. I knew he genuinely wanted to help, that he cared about me and was trying to save our marriage. But I also knew that it was impossible. My heart already belonged to someone else, and I couldn't keep living this double life. That night, I lay in bed for a long time, unable to sleep. Tom slept beside me, his breathing steady and calm. But inside me, a storm raged. I knew that soon I would have to make a choice. I couldn't keep deceiving Tom, and I couldn't continue my relationship with Lewis in secret. It wasn't fair to either of them, but making that choice was harder than I thought. Lewis wasn't just an infatuation. He was someone who had made me feel alive again. His passion, his attention, his care. It had all filled my life with something I hadn't felt in a long time. But Tom was my husband, the person I had shared my life and memories with. That day when everything collapsed, I never expected the secret I had kept hidden for so long to unravel so suddenly. Tom and I were sitting at dinner, and the evening seemed as ordinary as any other. I was trying to stay calm, holding back the memories of Lewis, with whom I had spent so much time over the past few weeks. Everything was going as usual until what I feared most finally happened. Tom sat across from me, his face calm, until he placed his phone on the table and reached for mine. I noticed the movement, but didn't say anything. We didn't have the habit of checking each other's phones. He unlocked it easily and began scrolling. My heart clenched. I knew there were messages from Lewis, but I hoped they would go unnoticed. But then came the moment I dreaded. Tom froze. His eyes locked on the screen, and the room fell into a deafening silence. I froze too, realizing that everything between us was about to collapse. I knew exactly what he had seen, the message that left no room for doubt. Lewis had written something that fully exposed our affair, something that proved I had betrayed Tom. "What is this?" His voice was hoarse, filled with anger that he was clearly trying to hold back. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Inside, a storm of emotions raged: fear, guilt, confusion. I didn't know how to explain what had been happening for the past few months, how to explain why I had allowed this to happen. "Are you going to answer me?" Tom continued, his voice growing louder. "Is this a message from Lewis? Did you sleep with him?" Those words cut through me like a knife. I could no longer deny the truth, though part of me wanted to lie, say nothing happened, that it was just a misunderstanding. But I saw the look in his eyes, and I knew he wouldn't believe me. "Tom, I began, but he interrupted me. "Just tell me the truth." His voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with a desperate plea. "I need to know." I closed my eyes, gathering all my strength to say what could no longer be hidden. I couldn't lie anymore, couldn't pretend everything was fine. I knew that if I lied now, it would be the end of our marriage, because Tom would never be able to trust me again. "Yes," I whispered. "I was with him." Saying those words aloud shattered both of us. The room was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, heavy and uneven. Tom stared at me, and I saw how his face changed, as if he was trying to process what he had just heard. His hands were trembling, and he clenched his fists, clearly trying not to let his emotions take over. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice icy, though I knew it was just a facade. Inside, he was breaking. I was silent for a few seconds, unsure of what to say. Lying no longer made sense. "A few months," I admitted. "It started after we began working on the project. I don't know how it happened." Tom nodded, as if gathering his thoughts. His face grew harder, and in his eyes, I saw a mix of anger and pain. "Do you love him?" he asked. And that question became the hardest one for me. Did I love Lewis? Or was it just a passion that had consumed me? Inside, everything was tangled, and I didn't know how to answer. Lewis had become someone important to me, but was it love? Or was it just an escape from what was happening in my marriage? "I don't know," I finally answered, realizing it was the truth. "I'm not sure." Those words seemed to be the final blow for Tom. He rose from his seat, his movements sharp and filled with rage. "You're not sure?" he exclaimed, his voice full of pain. "You're destroying our marriage for someone you're not even sure about?" I lowered my head, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. It hurt me to see him like this, to know that I had caused him so much pain. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but I knew those words wouldn't change anything. Tom stood in front of me silently, his breathing heavy, and I could see him struggling to keep himself from losing control. I didn't know what would happen next, but I understood that our marriage would never be the same. "I'm leaving for a few days," he finally said, his voice full of resolve. "I need time to think." I nodded, knowing this wasn't just a break, it was the end. Tom grabbed his jacket and walked out of the house, leaving me standing there in the emptiness. In that moment, I realized that my life was falling apart and that there was no way to fix it anymore. When the door closed behind Tom, a frightening silence filled the house. It felt as though part of my life had left with him. I was left alone, and the emptiness surrounding me became unbearable. I knew this moment would come, but I wasn't prepared for how heavy it would be. My life was falling apart, and I stood in the center of this catastrophe, realizing that I was the cause of this destruction. I sank onto the couch, staring into the void. There were no clear thoughts in my head, just the heavy feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. Tom was gone, and I didn't know if he would ever come back. This departure wasn't just temporary. It was an attempt to escape from the pain I had caused him. Hours passed, but it felt like time had stopped. I could only hear the ticking of the clock and my heavy breathing. Lewis had sent me a few messages asking how I was feeling, but I didn't know how to respond. What could I say to him? That everything was ruined? That I had nowhere left to go? In the evening, I finally decided to call Lewis. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could ease my pain, even just a little. When he answered, his voice was soft and calming, as always. "Megan, how are you?" he asked, though there was a note of concern in his voice. "Tom left," I replied, and that was all I could say. My throat tightened, and the tears welled up in my eyes again. "I'll come over," Lewis said quickly. "We'll talk." But when he arrived, I realized that talking wouldn't help. We sat on the couch, and Lewis held my hand. But the passion that once existed between us was no longer there. We both knew that our relationship had been the cause of my family's destruction, and this realization weighed heavily on both of us. "I don't know what to do," I finally said, looking at Lewis. "I've ruined everything, and I'm not sure if I can fix it." Lewis sighed, his face reflecting confusion. "Megan," he began, carefully choosing his words, "I didn't know things would go this far. I didn't want this. Neither of us did. But now, here we are." He spoke while looking into my eyes, and I understood that even Lewis didn't know how to handle this. We were both trapped in a situation we couldn't control. Our affair, which once seemed thrilling and exciting, now brought nothing but pain. "Do you think this was all a mistake?" I asked quietly, never taking my eyes off his face. Lewis paused for a moment, his eyes darkened, and he lowered his head. "I think we both ended up in a difficult situation," he finally responded. "I don't know what's right. I know that what we had was real, but it led to destruction." His words were honest, but they hurt me. I knew Lewis couldn't give me the answers I was seeking. Our relationship, which once seemed so important, had now become a source of pain. I could no longer ignore that fact. Lewis left me that evening, and I was alone again. For the first time in a long while, I truly felt alone. Without Tom, without Lewis, without a clear understanding of what to do next. I sat in the silence, staring out the window, wondering what would become of my life now. Looking back, I realized that my marriage to Tom had been falling apart for some time, but I had chosen the wrong path to deal with it. Instead of trying to talk to him, I allowed my feelings for Lewis to take over, and now I was paying a high price for that. That night, I lay awake for hours, trying to find answers to my questions. I wondered what would happen next, what I should do with this life I had destroyed with my own hands. But there were no answers, only loneliness and a sense of being lost. The next morning, Tom didn't come back. I received a message from him saying that he needed more time. I didn't know what that meant, but I suspected that our marriage was likely over. I had broken his trust, and it would be nearly impossible to rebuild it. Lewis and I continued texting, but everything felt different. There was no longer that lightness and passion between us. The realization that our relationship had caused the destruction of my family weighed on both of us. Lewis, too, began to question what lay ahead, and I wasn't sure if he saw a future for us together. One thought kept running through my mind. What now? I had lost Tom, but what had I gained in return? My life was in ruins, and now I was left alone to face the consequences of my actions. I knew that soon I would have to make important decisions, and those decisions would determine my future. After Tom left, I felt like I had lost everything. The life I was so proud of, the one I had built over the years, had fallen apart. But deep down, I couldn't just give up. Despite everything that had happened, I wanted to get Tom back, to restore our marriage. I understood that I had made a terrible mistake, that my affair with Lewis had destroyed everything between Tom and me, but I couldn't leave it as it was. I spent several days thinking about how to fix everything. I knew honesty and openness were needed, and that I had to acknowledge all my mistakes to Tom. I needed to show him that I was ready to fight for our marriage, that I understood the enormity of my betrayal and wanted to make things right. Deep down, I knew it would be difficult, if not impossible, but I was willing to do whatever it took to regain what I had lost. When Tom finally came home a few days later, I already knew what I needed to do. He looked exhausted, his eyes red as if he hadn't slept for nights. We sat across from each other at the table, and I saw that the warmth that once filled his eyes was gone. Now there was only coldness and distrust. "Tom," I began, unable to delay the conversation any longer. "I want to apologize. For everything. For deceiving you. For destroying our marriage." Tom remained silent, looking at me with an expression that was impossible to read. I continued. "I know what I did is unforgivable, but I want to fight for us. I want us to try to rebuild our marriage. I've realized my mistakes, and I'm ready to correct them." Tom still said nothing. His gaze was heavy, and I felt that his silence spoke louder than words. After a while, he finally spoke, his voice low and tired. "Megan, I've been trying to think this through. I tried to figure out if I could forgive you, but..." He trailed off, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "I can't. You betrayed me. You lied to me. You were with another man behind my back. I don't know how to live with that." Those words hit me with a force that almost knocked me off balance. I knew Tom was hurt, but I hadn't fully grasped the depth of his pain. I understand," I whispered, feeling everything inside me tighten. "But maybe we could try to start over. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust back." Tom shook his head, his eyes darkening with emotion. "No, Megan, I don't think that's possible. I can't trust you anymore. Every time I look at you, I see your betrayal, and I don't want to live like that." Tears welled up in my eyes. I felt everything I had hoped for slowly slipping out of my hands. I wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in my throat. "I filed for divorce," Tom said quietly, and those words shattered me completely. I didn't know how to respond. My heart was breaking from the pain, but at that moment, I realized there was nothing more I could do. Tom had made his choice, and that choice left no place for me in his life. "You'll be able to start over," Tom said, his voice calm but filled with exhaustion. "So will I, but not together. Our paths have diverged." Those words echoed in my head, and I understood that this was the end. The end of our marriage, the end of our life together. I had lost him forever, and there was no way back. When Tom left, leaving me alone in our empty living room, I realized that this was the final chapter of our story. I sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. My attempt to fix our marriage had failed. Tom couldn't forgive me, and now I had to accept that. The life I had built over the years had crumbled because of one mistake, one moment of weakness, and now I was left alone, with no way to fix it. When I look back at everything that has happened, I realize one thing. Sometimes one choice, one moment, can change your entire life. I didn't think about the consequences when I started seeing Louis. I was consumed by the feelings he stirred in me, forgetting that sooner or later, all of it would destroy my life. I was running away from reality, not thinking that this escape would lead me to a point of no return. Now I'm left alone. Tom is never coming back. His trust is shattered, and I understand him. I deserve this. I made a terrible mistake that cost me everything I valued. I should have fought for our marriage, worked through the issues with Tom, instead of seeking comfort elsewhere. I betrayed him. I betrayed us. Louis is gone too. Our relationship was built on passion, but as soon as reality hit us both, we realized it wasn't something that could last. He was the one who helped me see a different side of life. But in the end, he became part of the mistake that destroyed my life. Our affair was a spark, but it couldn't withstand the weight of its consequences. Now, sitting alone in our empty house, I think about what I could have done differently. Maybe if I had opened up to Tom sooner, we could have saved our marriage. Maybe if I hadn't let myself get carried away with Louis, things would be different. But these are only guesses. The past can't be changed, and I will have to live with the decisions I made. Life has taught me a lesson. Being honest with yourself and your loved ones is the only way to avoid what happened to me. I was looking for something in Louis that I was missing in my marriage, but I forgot that real relationships require work, honesty, and understanding. Instead of building bridges, I burned them. My advice for anyone facing a similar situation: don't make the mistakes I did. Strive for honesty, even when it hurts. Running away from problems never solves them. It only makes them worse. If something is lacking in your relationship, talk about it. Work on what matters to you instead of seeking comfort where it doesn't belong. My life is empty now, all because of my choices. I can only hope that, in time, I will find the strength to rebuild my life and never repeat the mistakes that led me here.